Hi, Pirates. All right, so today we're going to finish our book, which is really exciting. So when we left off, Albert had kind of swooped in, and the colored sparks were flying through the air, and all of a sudden, instead of the chair there, Albert stood life size. And so we kind of left off on a bit of a cliffhanger. So like I told you guys in the last chapter, we're going to read 2 today. So the next chapter is called All is Revealed. And then I'm not going to tell you the title of the last chapter because it might give something away that you're going to find out in this chapter, and I don't want to give it away. In thinking about our next chapter book, I kind of have to choose from the books that I have at home, which is a little limited. So next week for our read alouds, I will either do maybe a picture book, or I might have you guys read a story online and then do a response for me. But know that I would like to do another chapter book. It just might take me a bit to get one that we can all read together. So just know that I'll be working on that and it'll be coming. All right, next chapter, All is Revealed. Albert's big entrance struck everyone silent. Osmond was so scared that he would have dropped into his armchair, except that it wasn't there anymore. Osmond, Osmond, said Albert, you are indeed the shiftiest and most dishonorable creature going about on 2 legs. Oh, and greetings from my parents. They're just back from their journey, and they'd like your fire raisers and book robbers to know they'll spend the rest of their miserable lives as cockroaches, scurrying around outside our castle, unless they unchain my sister and the noble knight right this minute. Osmond was not the only one who turned to stare uneasily at the castle upon hearing Albert's words. White fire was spraying down from the gargoyles' mouths into the moat, and up on the battlements stood 2 figures whom none of the besiegers had ever seen before. A few of the soldiers, their fingers trembling, began undoing the bonds that held Igraine and the sorrowful knight captive, but their lord and master obviously hadn't yet taken the gravity of the situation. Stop that, thundered Osmond in such a loud voice that the soldiers flinched back in alarm. What are you waiting for? Grab that jug-eared beanpole. Albert spread his arms wide and smiled, the way he did when he'd left a big fat spider dangling over Igraine's bed. Fire danced along his arms, over the backs of his hands, and down his fingers. Even his hair was sprinkled with tiny flames. You're in trouble, Osmond, he said. Real trouble. And if you don't know what that means, you're about to find out. Igraine freed herself from her half-loosened bonds and helped the sorrowful knight to undo his. No one was taking any notice of them. They were all staring at Albert. Seize him by death in the cauldron, shouted Osmond, but his soldiers didn't budge. Thunder rolled behind them, making their hair stand on end under their helmets, and another flash of lightning, followed by a third, flickered across the black sky. 2 shining white globes struck the ground at Osmond's feet, smoking hot and scattering sparks. The lightning was so bright that everyone, even Igraine and the sorrowful knight, had to close their eyes for a moment. When they could see again, Sir Lamorak and the fair Melisande were standing beside Albert. Igraine's father was carrying Sisyphus, and 2 books of magic were sitting on her mother's shoulders. Osmond stared at those books so greedily that they put out their tongues at him. Allow us to introduce ourselves, Osmond, said Sir Lamorak politely. I am Lamorak, also known as Lamorak the Wily or Lamorak the Witty, and this is my extremely clever and, as you can see, extremely beautiful wife, Melisande. We, said Melisande, taking a step toward Osmond, are the parents of this jug-eared young man and the girl in silver armor there. And as I am sure you can imagine, we are not particularly happy about your treatment of our children, let alone your dishonorable behavior toward the noble knight who is facing you now. Thank you very much, she added, giving the sorrowful knight her most beautiful smile. Thank you very much indeed for your truly chivalrous aid. The knight bowed, looking embarrassed. As for Sir Lamorak, he turned to Osmond again. The fact is, he said, we are rather annoyed, as you will soon find out for yourself. Books? Page 232, please. Da capo fortissimo. The 2 books began to hum. It sounded like the angry buzzing of a couple of hornets. Igraine had never heard them sing such notes before. Tiny flames flickered up Osmond's dais, surrounding him with the wreath of fire, and then creeping down from the platform like a burning fuse on their way over to Rowan Heartless. The whispering woods began to rustle so loudly that the night was filled with an eerie roar, and the water snakes slithered out of the moat and wound their way, hissing across the tilting grounds and toward the tents. So on this page is just the books of magic there. Osmond's soldiers groaned in terror. They retreated from the flames, but now here came the snakes. In panic, they stumbled into one another, trod on each other's feet, pushed and shoved to just get away, but to get away where? The men ran off in all directions, anywhere but toward the place where the snakes were coiling around the tents with their tongues darting in and out. Cries of fear drowned out the rustling of the forest, and soon Osmond was alone on his dais. Only Igraine and the sorrowful knight were left on the now deserted tilting ground, and a few steps away from them, grim-faced and with his sword drawn, stood Rowan Heartless. The books were still humming, a deep and angry note, and now it sounded like bumblebees buzzing in a two-part harmony. The fair Melisande pushed her dark hair back from her forehead and placed her fingertips together, and then she said softly, "Wicked evil, black as night, now be empty, airy light. May the earth of you be free, let it not infested be. By such cruelty and greed, be gone, away from here, make speed. Treacherous miscreants, be off, Melisande has had enough." Light as a couple of balloons, Osmond and his Castellan champion floated up into the air. However much they kicked and struggled, flailed their arms about, cursed and swore, they couldn't get back to earth. They hung in the air as if invisible hands were holding them there. Igraine couldn't resist it. She went over to Osmond and gave him a push that sent him spinning around on his own axis like a top. "Now, now, my dear," said Sir Lamorak, hugging her tight, "we mustn't take advantage of our prisoner's unfortunate situation. That's not chivalrous, is it?" "You're right," said Igraine, burying her face in his robe. It still smelled very slightly of pig bristles in the stable. "That's what bothered me most about being a pig," said Melisande, putting her arm around Albert's shoulders, "not being able to give my children a hug." "You're miserable magicians!" Rowan almost turned a somersault as he drew his dagger from his belt and sliced the air with it. Shaking their heads, Igraine's parents looked at each other. "What are we going to do with them, dear heart?" asked Sir Lamorak. "Throw them in the castle moat?" Albert suggested. "Sisyphus will soon fish them out again, won't you, Sisyphus?" The cat expectantly licked his whiskers. "No way," said Igraine, picking him up. "They'd only give him indigestion, and they'd certainly bite my fingers when I feed the snakes. No, you'll all have to think of a better idea." At this, Osmond and Heartless were perfectly still. Obviously, they were worried by their conqueror's suggestions. Only the sorrowful knight had said nothing so far. He stood there, holding his injured shoulder, and looked up without a word at his enemies dangling in the air. "I think you ought to decide what happens to them," said Igraine, taking his hand. You've had more trouble with them than anyone." But the sorrowful knight shook his head. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I just want an answer. Where are the 3 ladies? Did you kill them, Heartless, or are you keeping them prisoner in some dark place?" They all looked up at Rowan Heartless, but he only smiled mockingly. "You'll never find out, sighing knight," he said. "However long you look, you'll never find them." At this point, Albert went over to them, looked up, and smiled his broadest, most typical Albert smile. "That's not very friendly of you," he said, "but then you never were very friendly. Now that I come to think of it, you were always an extraordinarily unpleasant person, not much nicer than your bungling magician of a master. But we have plenty of time. We'll leave Sisyphus here to watch you while we go back to Pimpernel Castle for some supper. If you happen to remember the answer to this noble knight's question, just send us the cat. However, if you have visitors while we're gone, for instance, all the peasants whose pigs and chickens you stole, or the men you forced to play soldiers for you, well," Albert shrugged his shoulders, "well, then it could get rather uncomfortable for you. Not everyone's as peace-loving as we and this noble knight are. But perhaps you'll still be alive when we come back. Who knows? We'll just have to see. Have fun all alone in the dark." Albert turned and led Igraine away from him. "Oh, my goodness, speaking of fun," he said, turning back again, "I do believe a few of your men are already on their way back, but I'm sure they love you so much for your kindness to them that—" "Stop!" Osmond's voice was considerably shriller than usual. "Go on! Tell him!" He snapped at his Castellan, giving him a kick that sent his spiky armor rattling. "Give that miserable sighing drip his answer, will you?" "No, darkness, take it, I'll do no such thing," snarled Rowan Heartless, jabbing his spiky armor into his master's side. "I like listening to his eternal sighing far too much. Why don't you do something?" What's the idea, leaving us here hovering, making us look like idiots to everyone? I thought you were such a great magician." Osmond made no reply to this. "At the moment, he's not a magician at all," Sir Lamorak replied for him. "I took care of that. Excuse me. And to whether he was ever a great one, well, opinions may differ on that point." Rowan Heartless cast his helpless master a scornful glance. "Be that as it may," he sneered, "even if your men carve us into slices, I won't say where those ladies are." "Then I will," shouted Osmond. He was paddling so frantically in the air that his shoe fell off. "They're in the tent! His tent!" Igraine looked at him disbelievingly. "Liar," she said. "I've been in the tent myself. There aren't any ladies there. I'd have noticed." Heartless stared down at her as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What are you talking about, minx?" he growled. "You've never been in my tent." "Of course she has," said Albert, speaking up again instead of Igraine. "She broke the spell on your lance. Why do you suppose it didn't help you to win your fight this time?" For the first time, a little color rose to Rowan Heartless's pale cheeks. "You just wait, minx," he said. "When I get back on the ground again—" "Which I guess isn't going to be for quite a while yet," Igraine coolly interrupted him. Her father gently picked up a mouse that had jumped off Albert's head onto his own and put it on his shoulder. "Well, well, Osmond," he said with a deep sigh, "so now you're trying to lie to us. How shabby of you. I think we really ought to go in for supper, as Albert suggested." With the mouse on his shoulders, he went to the edge of Osmond's dais. "Come along, my dear," he said, giving Igraine his hand. "You must be ravenously hungry after all your heroic deeds." "I wasn't lying," bellowed Osmond. "The three ladies are in his tent. I turned them into birds. That's what he wanted." Igraine stood still, thunderstruck. "Birds?" she asked. "Yes, birds! I said so!" Osmond was waving his arms around so vigorously that he suddenly found himself hanging in the air upside down. But Igraine turned to the sorrowful knight. "He's not lying after all," she said. "I saw those birds, but there were 4 of them." Okay, so this part of this book just gives me complete goosebumps and chills because as the reader, we finally figure out where the 3 ladies of the Mount of Tears have gone. And so the next chapter is called The 3 Ladies from the Mount of Tears. But you're also going to understand that there are 4 birds. So we've got 3 ladies of the Mount of Tears, but we have a 4th bird. And if you remember from the beginning of the story, there is somebody else who's been missing this whole time that you may not remember. Let's read. They all went to Rowan Heartless's tent, Igraine and the Sorrowful Knight, Albert and their parents, but they left Osmond and his champion, the Spiky Knight, where they were, dangling up in the air with Sisyphus guarding them. The cat wasn't very pleased until Melisande conjured up a bucket full of fat fish that persuaded him to stay put. It was dark in the hedgehog's red tent, pitch dark, but Albert, Sir Lamorak, and the fair Melisande were still covered with sparks from the magic lightning, and in their soft light the falcons on their perch were clearly visible. They were sitting hunched up with their heads under their wings. Once again, the smallest falcon was the first to be on alert, spreading its wings as it had when Igraine slipped past it before, and it uttered such a raucous cry that the other 3 brought their heads out from under their feathers too. "You see," said Igraine, 4 falcons. Perhaps the one that keeps getting so worked up is the only real bird." "Perhaps." The Sorrowful Knight went over to the birds and took the leather hoods off their heads. Bewildered, they blinked in the strange light that filled the tent. "Noble knight," said the fair Melisande, putting her hand on his armed shoulder, "your courage gave us the time we needed to return to our former shape. Now, let us help you." Incredulously, the Sorrowful Knight turned to her. "You think that you could break Osmond's spell?" "Definitely," replied Sir Lamorak. "Ordinary magic is considerably easier to reverse than magical mistakes, you know." The fair Melisande gently moved the knight aside, stood in front of the perch with the birds on it, and took the smaller of the books of magic off her shoulder. As soon as she sat it on her left hand, it began humming quietly. The falcons jerked their heads, alarmed, and listened to the strange sound. "Page 4, said Melisande, and the book opened at a page that was covered all over with illustrations of tiny, colorful animals, birds, and insects. They were crawling, leaping, and fluttering over the letters on the page as if they were alive. Melisande closed her eyes, raised the book a little higher in the air, and said in a voice that was hardly any louder than the whispering of the wind, "Be what once you were, you birds, what you were so long ago. Let me help you to remember you wore no feathers, well you know." The thin golden perch broke like a rotten twig under the weight of the 4 ladies who were suddenly sitting on it. Yes, 4. They landed with a bump on the carpet that Rowan Heartless had spread on the floor of his tent. When the confusion of skirts and veils had died down, the sorrowful knight helped his 3 lost ladies to their feet, with a happy smile on his face. But Igraine put out her hand to the 4th. "My word, Baroness," she said, helping the old lady up from the carpet. "What on earth are you doing here?" With a deep sigh, the old Baroness of Darkrock pushed her tangled gray hair back from her forehead and looked down at herself. "All present and correct," she said, relieved. "Thank goodness, no more feathers or no more claws on my toes." She felt her face a little anxiously and sighed happily again on discovering that she had a nose there instead of a hooked beak. "My dear Igraine," she said, tapping her smartly on the helmet and looking stern, "couldn't you have broken that horrible spell on me this morning? Didn't I flap those wretched wings hard enough when you were stumbling around me?" "But how was I to know it was you?" asked Igraine. "How come you let your nephew enchant you?" Embarrassed, the old lady picked a feather off her dress. "I thought he was quite nice," she murmured. "I have to admit, I was wrong." "Yes, indeed," said Sir Lamorak. "According to Bertram, Osmond poured all your stock of spicy meat into the moat at Darkrock. Granted, that will be good for your teeth, but—" "He did what?" the Baroness interrupted. "Where is he?" But Sir Lamorak had turned his back to her, for the other 3 ladies were shyly plucking his sleeve. They looked very like each other. All 3 had golden hair and were almost the same size. They wore beautiful but very impractical dresses, and they had tiny feet that would not be much use for running away from spiky knights. "Noble sir," said the tallest of the ladies, as the other 2 smiled very sweetly, "we owe you and your wife our infinite gratitude. If you wish, my sisters and I will serve you to the end of our days. Perhaps you need childminders for your son and daughter, or—" Albert and Igraine looked at each other in dismay. "No, no, that won't be necessary, really it won't," Albert interrupted the lady hastily. "My little sister does need supervision, it's true, but I can take care of that myself. And as for being rescued, you owe that almost entirely to this noble knight. Word of magician's honor." Looking embarrassed, the sorrowful knight bowed his head. "I allowed Heartless to steal you away," he said, without looking at the ladies. "I hope you will forgive me. I was not worthy to be your knight." "Oh, no, there he goes, talking nonsense again," muttered Igraine, but her mother gave her a warning look and put a finger to her lips. "Of course you're worthy," cried the 3 ladies. "You defended us most chivalrously. What could you do against such deceitful magic?" "Learn a little magic himself, maybe," Albert whispered to Igraine. However, the 3 ladies went up to the sorrowful knight, and one by one they kissed his dusty cheek. Igraine suppressed a groan. "Escort us back to our castle," said one of the ladies. "Be our protector again." The sorrowful knight bowed very, very deeply to her. "I will be happy to escort you back," he replied, "but I won't stay, for my skill in arms is not enough to protect you from magic and treachery. So I have decided to learn some new arts, and to study, if they will allow me," he said, turning around, "with the noble Sir Lamorak and the fair Melisande, and not least with their extremely clever son, Albert. In return, I offer to instruct your noble and very brave daughter Igraine in all the skills that a chivalrous knight must learn." All at once, Igraine's heart felt so light that she almost floated up to the top of the tent. "An excellent idea, sorrowful knight," said Sir Lamorak. Okay, so here are the the ladies with Albert and Igraine and the Baroness, I think, is here. Let me look. Yep. So the Baroness, Igraine, Albert, Sorrowful Knight, and then the 3 ladies. So if you remember in the beginning of the story, the Baroness is gone, and then Osmond tells Albert and Igraine that she's gone on a pilgrimage, that she's just gone on a journey. But we know now that the ladies and the Baroness all got turned into the birds that were hiding in, or were being put in, the Spiky Knight's tent. Such a good twist in this story. "And we offer you our services with the greatest pleasure, don't we?" "Oh, yes," the fair Melisande nodded, "but on one condition. Now that you are no longer a sorrowful, but, I hope, a happy knight, you must tell us your real name." "I was once known as Sir Urban of Wintergreen," said the sorrowful knight, "and I will go by that name again." And with these words he turned to Igraine. What do you say, squire? He asked. Will you come with me when I escort these three noble ladies back to their castle? After all, I am a knight with honor again, so I need a squire now. Igraine looked at her parents. Of course, I'd love to, she said, and the fair Millicent and Sir Lamorak the Wily sighed and nodded. Well, it would be a bit boring for you with just those three ladies, wouldn't it? Igraine whispered to the sorrowful knight. What did your noble squire say? Asked one of the ladies. Luckily, Sisyphus came in at that moment with a half-eaten fish in his mouth. Sisyphus, cried Albert, astonished. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be guarding the prisoners. Flown away, purred Sisyphus, settling down comfortably on the carpet with his fish. What do you mean? Asked Albert in alarm as the cat greedily smacked his lips. The wind blew them away, replied Sisyphus. What did you expect me to do? Fly after them? Igraine's parents looked at each other in dismay. The wind, my dear, murmured Sir Lamorak. Never thought of that, did we? Who flew away? Asked the Baroness, who was just reviving herself by sampling the Spiky Knight's provisions of spicy mead. Your nephew, replied Millicent, and his castellan. Oh, were those two turned into birds as well? Asked the Baroness. No, no, said Igraine, taking her hand. You see, it's a rather complicated story. So they all went back to Pimpernel Castle. Albert ordered the drawbridge to lower itself, which after some hesitation it did, and the fair Millicent broke the spell on the moat. No sooner had she lowered her hands than 25 dazed men emerged from the water lilies. The snakes carried them to the bank where Sir Lamorak and the sorrowful knight pulled them out of the water. The wind has blown your masters away, said Millicent as they stood before her dripping wet. The tents you see still standing there are empty. The siege is over. You can go home. Most of the men didn't wait to be told twice. They made off on their unsteady legs, but 5 men still stood there. What are you waiting for? Asked Albert impatiently. You can go. But the 5 just looked gloomily at the feet they had got back. We liked it down there, one of them murmured. What? Said Sir Lamorak. We want to be fish again, said a second man. It's a better life, enough to eat, no one's ordering you around. He looked longingly into the moat. I have a cat who eats fish, said Igraine, but that didn't seem to bother the men. So Sir Lamorak granted their wish. He turned the 5 of them back into fish, and then, with the help of the books of magic, he and the fair Millicent conjured up such a banquet as Pimpernel Castle had never seen before, with not a crumb of biscuit or a blue egg in sight. Albert entertained the 3 ladies until late into the night, getting his mice to do tricks for them, and Igraine finally had her chance to tell the Baroness all that had happened since her 12th birthday. The only part of the story she wasn't telling yet was how she had stolen the Baroness's favorite horse. The end. Oh, one of my favorites. So I'm sad that I didn't get to finish this book in person with you guys. And it is most definitely in my top 5 favorite stories ever. I love this book, and I think I've already told you that a million times before. So I hope you enjoyed listening to the last 2 chapters. I know this was a little bit longer today. Of course, you always have the option to illustrate. One that comes to mind for me is Osmond and his castellan floating up in the air and Sisyphus sitting with his little bucket of fish. So if you would like to take my illustration challenge today, that is one part you could illustrate. But of course, you always have the choice. So like I said earlier, I'm going to pick a book for us to read together so I can do some more read alouds with you guys. And I hope you enjoyed this book as much as I did. On the comments on Google Classroom, if you want to just tell me your thoughts on the ending of this book, that would be great, but we have to make sure that we don't spoil anything for people that haven't read this last chapter yet. Ooh, so maybe wait a little bit. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed.